Okay, we just went live here. We're probably start up in a little while. I thought it might be better to go live a little early rather than in the middle of something. We are at Church at the Crossroads, and if you're in the neighborhood, come by. It's on University Avenue. Well, I mean, everybody knows where Church of Crossroads is, right? Okay.
Don't get too quiet. We're going to wait for back. Nice little sync phenomena there.
The topic is over the Korean nuclear crisis, I guess, and specifically what it means for Hawaii. We'll have a couple of people presenting, including at least one from the University of Hawaii. I see Doug Chin in the house. Doug Chin's running for CD1, Congressional District 1. I don't see the other candidates. There are a bunch of other candidates for that seat, including Kaniela Ing. And they will be running against each other for the seat that Hanabusa vacated in order to run for governor against David Ige. So it's going to be an interesting 2018. Not necessarily. Here we go. Here we go. Let's do it.
So, thank you everyone for coming tonight. My name is Jairus Grove. I'm a professor of international relations at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. We called this event in part because I was concerned that there was not enough attention being played to the threat that the United States was playing to North Korea and to those in the Pacific who are caught between maybe one of the most reckless gambles of my lifetime, certainly one of the most reckless gambles since the end of the Cold War, and that there was very little interest in the actual nuts and bolts of how this crisis was unfolding. And so I was most interested in trying to recenter this question of threat around what I think is a long-term constitutional crisis in the United States over the president and what kind of authority the president has. And that was compounded by the sort of perfect storm of having a president for whose judgment no one had any reason to trust.
Just posted it.
Right? So we have this sort of confluence. Now, of course, because these events change daily, because we have an unpredictable leader, I also wanted to continue with the event because I think everyone thought that once Trump said he was going to meet with Kim Jong-un, the event was over. And I think we're already seeing, in fact, within 6 hours of announcing that this meeting was going to take place, Trump was already backpedaling, adding different kinds of deals that would have to be made before he would agree to show up, and confirming what's been leaked by his own staff to the New York Times today, which is that McMaster's and Mattis tried to interrupt him several times during the meeting with the South Korean envoy. Trump silenced them, finally said, "I've got this," and refused to allow anyone in the room who might actually know something about the issue to see how it should unfold. So I think rather than assuming that this is over, we should be very careful to not learn from dumb luck. So my next biggest concern is that what I think is an incredibly reckless strategy that's put all of us at risk, this idea of sort of massive pressure, will come to be seen as a great historical success if we back our way into a peace agreement with North Korea. And I'm going to talk about why I think that's in the long term not in the interest of the Pacific particularly, but not in the interest of global security either. So, Trump diplomacy fired. This came out after the Fire and Fury speech. In fact, it was on Breitbart for the Fire and Fury speech. Trump diplomacy or failure by design. So on October 4th, 2017, we have a leak that Tillerson calls Trump a moron. It's an unusual leak for the Secretary of State. The reason we come to find out that he says that Trump's a moron is because Tillerson was actually making up ground on the issue, right? He was getting returns from North Korea, and it looked like there was something like a settlement that could come, or at the very least, structure for negotiations and talks. Trump immediately sabotages the process and says, both over Twitter and on international news, that Tillerson doesn't have his support, basically gutting any opportunity for pursuing diplomacy. In November and December, Joseph Yun's office, the head of the Korean envoy who negotiated the return of the American student, leaks multiple times that any efforts and progress that's being made is immediately being sabotaged by Trump. That there's no support, and more to the point, we start getting the feelers that McMaster's is beginning to make this sort of greatest game argument that we either have a war with North Korea now, or we have a war with North Korea later, right? Opening up to this logic that diplomacy isn't even an option, right? And so what we should be doing is counting nuclear weapons. Would we rather try to get 30 to 60 nuclear weapons today, or wait a year when it's 120 or more? Once that logic rolls out, we start seeing the massive buildup that starts to occur. January 30th, 2018, Victor Cha, who is, I think anyone who has ever met him would never be called a dove. In fact, one of the most aggressive advocates for strikes during the George W. Bush administration, is let go unexpectedly after being vetted and on his way to be presented to the South Koreans because he says he wouldn't pass a litmus test for either a strike on Korea or an extraordinarily provocative evacuation of Seoul of the 260,000 American citizens. February 27th, Joseph Yun, the last career North Korean specialist who's working in the administration with that kind of experience, leaves unexpectedly, says he's going to retire, basically in the middle of maybe the most important job of his career, leaving us to wonder why that had happened, and thinking back to what he said in November and December, and presuming that happened. So we have this image, right, that we're supposedly not really taking more seriously. Everyone in the administration says, hey, don't worry, this bloody nose strike talk, we've never used the phrase bloody nose. That's true. I don't think that they ever used the phrase bloody nose. What's clear from McMaster's perspective is there was a presumption of a decapitation strike, right, to develop the capacity to take out the entirety of North Korean leadership and to secure all the nuclear weapons as well as nuclear facilities and the biological and chemical weapons in North Korea. That is not the kind of scenario we would ever call a bloody nose strike. It's not showing resolve so that we can increase our deterrence. This is the hope of something like regime change. That gets a lot scarier when John Bolton stops criticizing the Trump administration and starts writing editorials in the Wall Street Journal, as he did a week and a half ago, saying that we should hit North Korea fast and now, and that it's perfectly legal to do so. That under the notion of imminent threat in the Constitution, the president is authorized to violate the War Powers Agreement, and he should move forward. Monday, Bolton goes on Fox and Friends and makes the same argument, is using the pronoun we, not they, when speaking about the administration. The day after, Trump meets with Bolton. Now, 2 days after that, Trump reverses course, apparently. I think that should trouble us more. The fact that he changes his mind from day to day on something that is quite literally a conflict that could kill millions of people per day. Right? We could look at World War II level casualties per day if there's nuclear exchange. And that is something that we should take quite seriously. The response from Congress has been to try to reassert the War Powers Act. I think we should take that seriously. I think that it's an impressive maneuver in the Senate. In the House, I'll talk about in a minute, it's a little bit more aggressive. But I'm going to give a couple of reasons for why, in particular with Trump, we shouldn't rest on the War Powers Act. The first is that Congress doesn't have to be notified for 48 hours. That seemed really impressive in the Vietnam era. In an era of B-2 bombers, assassination drones deployed to South Korea, F-35 strike fighters, and potentially ICBMs, right? Or tactical nuclear weapons in theater. 48 hours that's the ballgame, right? That's the worst case scenario already unfolding. The second is they forgot to actually look at the debates over the War Powers Act. The Democratic sponsor of the act itself, Democrat from Missouri, was asked, do nuclear weapons fall under the War Powers Act? And Congress decided no, that it was an executive arsenal explicitly delegated by law to the US president. That was affirmed under Carter, and we'll talk about it in a minute, has been affirmed again by the Nuclear Posture Review under the Trump administration. So we have no constitutional protection, which means we stand only with a decision between us and war. There are already 3 carrier groups and nuclear submarines in theater. We have B-2s in Guam, we have F-35s in Okinawa, we have 200 specially trained officers ready to fly those in Guam that have already been deployed. The THAAD deployment, along with the Aegis-based interceptors, mean that we already have the infrastructure we think supposedly will keep us safe, although I promise you, if you want to talk about the methodology by which we say an interceptor works, it would make you very sad. Basically, think of it this way. There are 12 categories for a successful interceptor. Only 1 category is hitting the missile, which means that you can score over an A+ on an interceptor system and never hit rocket. 4, the munitions and equipment are already deployed to Wuhan, Seoul, and Okinawa as well. So we're starting to see something like a Trump doctrine, which is, basically all angst, all screaming all the time until it isn't. We already have the Nuclear Posture Review. It's now out. It focuses on the renewed capability of competitors and the reason why the United States needs to get back in the game of nuclear modernization. It declares a return to great power war in a way that we haven't discussed since before the end of the Cold War. And most importantly, it says there's a renewed interest in both the technology and capability for what's called flexible command. That means the president being able to delegate the power to use nuclear weapons to lower and lower officer ranks within theaters so that nuclear weapons do not need congressional review. And finally, the development of what they call more usable weapons. These are tactical nuclear weapons, nuclear bunker busters, and low-yield options, which are supposed to fill in supposed gaps in the escalation ladder, right? Allow us to play kind of nuclear wargaming with Russia and China in a way that will make it more likely that we'd use nuclear weapons. This came out in the New York Times today. This is the image, or what's being called by some, like Graham Allison, the Thucydides trap with China, in which we already think about a kind of ongoing, not only Cold War, but potentially hot war with nuclear weapons in country, meaning in theater, right? Similarly, we have very, very similar debates from people like Matthew Kronig at Georgetown, who was one of the people who was consulted on the on the Nuclear Posture Review, that we want to have weapons that we can use inside the European theater. Now, why is that important? Why is it important that we want to develop smaller, more usable weapons that have lower levels of command? Because it totally changes how deterrence works. From Trump's perspective, it's not the fear of the Cold War, where if the United States starts a conflict with the Soviet Union, the United States continent faces the consequences. It's the ability to develop nuclear warfighting, where they can look back and say, well, if the gamble doesn't pay off, it's only the Pacific. If the gamble doesn't pay off, it's only the Baltics, right? That completely changes the way that people take risks. And I think the massive pressure strategy reflects that disregard for the lives of people who live in Wuhan, who live in Japan and Okinawa and Seoul, and I believe also in Hawaii. Which is not to say that they are already ready to sacrifice us, but that they are playing a gamble where the red line between when they're willing to go to war and not go to war is not the Pacific, it's the mainland. And that's also true in the Russian case, and I think that that's a scary development to return to a Cold War era that no one in the Cold War ever wanted to go back to. A friend of mine named Van Jackson, who studied this for a very long time, much longer than I have, said the only comparison you can make is this is like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but everybody in the room is Curtis LeMay. Everybody is daring to go to war. So what is to be done? What could we think about doing? The first, I think we have to create pressure for diplomacy. It could end at any moment. I mean, any moment. The decision to go from war to diplomacy happened seemingly in a moment. You talk to no strategist. 2, we need to mobilize and organize with the mainland to take back nuclear war powers and adopt a no first use nuclear policy. Our president should not be capable of starting and ending a war at the same time. It's not what the framers intended. It's not how the Constitution was designed. And Congress, a debate, a declaration of war should be necessary to start the most important event in US history, right? A nuclear war between the United States and any peer competitor would be equivalent to the number of people wiped out on the American mainland during first contact. It would be the largest mass destruction of populations since first contact. Brian Schatz and Tulsi Gabbard are both sponsoring strong bills. I think it's worth giving them a little bit of credit for this, but they're going to need a lot more pressure before they're willing to put this at the top of their agenda. They know it's a long shot. I think we have to start selling this to our senators and our congresspeople as a necessary fight to get back on the agenda. I don't know if people have checked news, but the conflict with North Korea and the risk to the Pacific is not on the news, right? Because unfortunately, Seoul is not a porn star. And Hawaii is not Jared Kushner. And right, the possibility of returning to a Cold War era of nuclear war fighting, not nuclear deterrence, nuclear war fighting, is so unthinkable to most people that they just assume it's absurd. The last thing is we have to begin now to stop the nuclear posture review. There are going to be tests on all the Pacific Islands. That doesn't mean nuclear tests, but it means that we're going to test more interceptors, we're going to test a new generation of missiles, we're going to deploy more nuclear bombs and nuclear missiles to the Pacific. There are going to be real consequences for the people who live in those places. It will be the Marshall Islands, it will be Hawaii, it will be Okinawa, it will be Guam that has to store these incredibly dangerous weapons. And I think we'll break the CTBT. I cannot imagine, and I've talked to people who worked on the NPR, that the United States would ever agree to deploy missiles or devices or warhead structures that they had never tested. We've never done that before. I don't think we'll ever do that. Which means that if they're allowed to build new nuclear weapons, that will be used as a justification to begin nuclear testing again. And we know who gets harmed by those, right? It's not New York City that gets harmed by nuclear tests. It's the Western Shoshone, right, that gets harmed by nuclear tests. It's the people, right, of Bikini Atoll that get harmed by nuclear tests, right? The downwinders are the people who will bear that burden. So I think we should think about that very seriously, and I hope this is a place to start the conversation about how we organize to make sure that we have a somewhat more sane foreign policy. Thanks.
So let me introduce you to Jairus Grove, who just spoke. Obviously very eager to get going because of the urgency of this issue. But Jairus Grove is an associate professor in the political science department at UH Manoa and the director of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies. Dr. Grove completed his PhD in international relations and political theory at Johns Hopkins University. He has two books coming out shortly, one called Savage Ecology, Geopolitics at the End of the World with Duke University Press, and the second one called Target Practice, Automated Killing and the Dehumanization of American Sovereignty with Roman and Littlefield. So Jairus, if I could give you this.
Oh.
And our second panelist today is Ralph Kosa, who is the president of the Pacific Forum in Honolulu, and the senior editor of the forum's quarterly electronic journal called Comparative Connections. Mr. Kosa has decades of expertise in Asia, China, geopolitics and international security, governance and the rule of law, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, and is the primary U.S. representative and former international co-chair of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Regional Forum Experts and Eminent Persons Group. as well as a founding member and current co-chair of the Multinational Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific. Mr. Kosa served in the U.S. Air Force from 1966 to 1993, achieving the rank of colonel and last serving as special assistant to the commander of the U.S. Pacific Command. I should introduce myself. I'm going to be your moderator tonight, and after Mr. Kosa speaks, we're going to open it up for a Q&A because we want to hear all of your voices and we want you to raise all of your concerns and try and get all of your questions answered. I'm Nandita Sharma. I'm an associate professor of sociology at UH Manoa. And I know nothing about this topic, but I'm happy to moderate, and I'm really eager to learn a lot more about it. Before we move on to Mr. Kosa, I wanted to thank the Church of the Crossroads, particularly Kelly Garrett, Bill Petty, Paul Horiuchi, and John Kawamoto for so quickly and congenially providing us with this wonderful meeting space, and to all the many volunteers who have made this event possible. Gay Chan, Megan Bent, Richard Wark, Wayne Levin, Doreen Minatadani, Nancy Marker, and Arcelita Imasa. And I wanted to warn you that if any of you have parked in that Banyan parking lot without paying, unfortunately you're going to get ticketed. So please either go and pay or move your car to the street or to this parking lot behind here, because I would hate to see you have to pay a $40 fine. And lastly, we are very, very honored to have with us tonight Lieutenant Governor Doug Chin. So I would like to call you, if you wouldn't mind, just giving us some comments. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and aloha. It's really fantastic to be able to see so many people here on a Saturday night gathered to talk about a very serious subject, and it's an honor for me to be here with you all. I think, as most of you know, I just became Lieutenant Governor about 4 weeks ago. Prior to that, I was, thank you. Thank you, but prior to that, I was the Hawaii Attorney General, and so part of, I think one of the blessings of being able to take on this position is it's actually allowed me to be able to spend more time in the community, being able to hear from people and to be able to talk about issues that are important to the people of Hawaii. And so even after the presentation that we've already heard from Dr. Grove, I feel just even more determined than ever that I not get in the way of the outstanding presentations that are happening here and the discussion, and also from being able to hear from everyone here. I just want to say that my concern I think is probably what everybody else's concern here is I'm just thinking about the people of Hawaii, and just wanting to make sure that whatever is happening with this very significant development in terms of the White House and the President agreeing to meet with the North Korea leader, I think our greatest concern on behalf of the people of Hawaii is that we deserve to have a president and a White House that is going to properly plan and really execute this kind of meeting in a way that really recognizes how important diplomacy is. And I think for so long, we've always respected the fact that the United States has had a State Department that is fully functioning, that's fully staffed, that has people who are very professional, and perhaps our greatest concern from what we've seen in the last year is that we actually have a situation where the State Department has been gutted, and there's a lot of empty business as has already been described. And I think what we can already see from the discussions that have been occurring is that the administration has been derelict in its duty to lead a disciplined, calculated, and diplomatic strategy with our allies in the Far East. And clearly, we can even see if the reports are true that this was a very haphazard decision by a president who often likes to be flattered in his ego, especially from authoritarian leaders' experience, or not greatest experience, but the most difficult experience, was seeing that we had an administration where we had a president that was really just overstepping his authority. And I really think that that's been the challenge that we've all been facing, is to try to figure out what are the different ways that we as the people of Hawaii can be able to fight back. And one way, of course, is in the courts. I was able to do that as the Attorney General. Another way is through Congress, and I'm really interested to hear what's being said there. And then the third way is with the public speaking up. And so with that, I'm just going to close and say I'm really looking forward to being able to listen and hear from everybody. Thank you so much for Dr. Grove and Mr. Kosa for being here, and for Professor Sharma in organizing this. It's an honor to be here with all of you, so thank you.
Well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Aloha. I'm Ralph Casa, president of the Pacific Forum. We're a foreign policy think tank located here in Honolulu. We've been around since 1975. We were founded by a retired admiral who had been a submariner during World War II. And he, during a particularly tense period during the war, as his submarine was facing depth charges from a Japanese destroyer, he said, if I live through this, I'm going to find a better way of solving problems other than people going to war with one another. He remembered that pledge in 1975 when he retired from the Navy and created the Pacific Forum. I'm sad to announce he passed away this last week at 101 years old. God bless him for that, but we'll miss him. But he left us a legacy that we're trying to follow, and that's to find a better way of solving problems. We're nonpartisan. We're an equal opportunity critic. We were very happy to criticize this administration, and we were happy to criticize the past one. We're also happy to praise them when they do something right, and we try to keep politics out of it. I will tell you that my immediate reaction to the presentation this evening is take a deep breath, relax. I think first of all, there's a considerably less than 1% chance that Hawaii will come under attack from North Korea. I think maybe it's 1 or 2%, it's certainly enough to worry about, but not to fret about, that there's going to be a war on the Korean Peninsula. I don't believe that either Kim Jong-un or Donald Trump is crazy. I will assure you that Mr. Trump was not my first choice to be president. In fact, he wasn't even my second, third, fourth, fifth, or sixth choice to be president, but in fact, he is president. And while I share a lot of the skepticism and concern about him, I have a little more faith in our system of checks and balances and the way we operate. Kim Jong-un does not have a button on his desk, nor does Donald Trump. So everybody talking about my button is bigger than your button is I think, sort of irresponsible chatter, but it's not connected to reality. As some of you know, there is a military, I think it's a 2-star general, that carries a code with him for one reason, and that's if someone comes into the president and says, a nation, and in today's world that could only be either Russia, the former Soviet Union, or perhaps China, but Russia is the only country on earth that presents an existential threat to the United States with its nuclear capabilities. And if someone comes in and says, Mr. President, there are 100 or 200 Russian missiles heading toward the United States, and you need to make the decision whether to push that button or not push that button to retaliate before we lose our capability, that's the nuclear box, if you will. There isn't one that says, well, we hit column A and you can hit North Korea, and column B is China, and column C. Any kind of a war with North Korea or with anyone else will be the subject of planning, intense planning, building up of forces. The war plans, the public version of the war plans call for something in the neighborhood of 500,000 troops to be moved to the Korean Peninsula. So if we were going to start a, quote, preventive war, you would see a massive buildup. What the president does have the authority to do is respond to an imminent threat. And the Congress can, I think, attempt to, pass legislation that says the president is not allowed to shoot at anybody without Congress's approval. I don't think that'll ever make it past this Supreme Court or any Supreme Court, to be quite honest. I'm all in favor of finding ways to keep things calm, and I don't think that the rhetoric on either side has been helpful when it comes to North Korea. But my own view, and I spend most of my time, quite frankly, trying to analyze North Korea, not Washington. I leave Washington to others. There's lots of folks doing that. And my view is that no leader does anything that is irrational to them. So if we say that somebody is acting irrationally, what we're saying is we don't understand their rationale. The reason North Korea acts the way they do, quite simply, is it works. North Koreans keep their only export is threats, so they continue to try to threaten, and in return, they're hoping that at some point we will reward them, not for doing good things, but we will reward them to stop doing bad things. And this has been the debate, was the debate throughout the Obama administration and Bush and Clinton before him, on whether or not the North Koreans would actually move in the direction of denuclearization, or whether they would just halt tests or halt bad behavior in return for some kind of reward. So that's what I think faces the Trump administration at this time. My own view is that in many respects, the Trump administration's policy toward North Korea has essentially been the same as the Obama administration's policy, only louder. And part of this was both policies were based on trying to put enough pressure on North Korea to convince them that they had to make a choice between their survival, either economic, political, or military, between their survival and having nuclear weapons. Right now, the North thinks that having nuclear weapons is essential to their survival. And the attempt of previous administrations and this administration is to convince them of the opposite, that having these weapons puts your survival at risk, and that there's a much better deal, a pot of gold at the end of the particular rainbow if you make the right choice and go in the right direction. I think that this administration has sent terribly mixed signals to the North Koreans in many respects. And on the one hand, we've been sort of telling them, you better give up your nuclear weapons or you're going to collapse. And on the other hand, we've been saying, but we're not pursuing regime change and we're not trying to get rid of the regime. Well, of course, if they really believe we're not trying to get rid of the regime, then there's no reason for them to give up their nuclear weapons. So I think there's been my own sense, and I have no inside information and no security clearances, but my own sense is that they've been playing a game of good cop, bad cop between the Secretary of State and the President's office. And it's managed to make a lot of South Koreans nervous, a lot of Japanese nervous, a lot of Americans, including many in this room, nervous. The only ones that don't really seem too nervous have been the North Koreans. I meet with the North Koreans regularly 3 or 4 times a year, and they describe what's going on in the U.S. as a burlesque show, sort of a carnival type atmosphere. On the other hand, the North has now said that they're willing to come to the table and talk about nuclear weapons. That's a step forward. I don't call it a breakthrough yet because I've been with the North Koreans before when they've told me that. But the price involved was the U.S. ends its alliance to South Korea, goes home, closes the nuclear umbrella, and essentially leaves the South for the North to try to take over. Obviously, we're not going to go down that path or play that game, nor should we. At the end of the day, the one complaint that I read over and over and over again, and I heard it again tonight with all due respect to my colleague, I know Joe Yoon. Joe is a great professional. He's a very capable Foreign Service officer who will seriously be missed. But we have several hundred extremely well-qualified Korea experts in the State Department. We have hundreds of extremely qualified Korea experts in the Defense Department, who is our Korea desk at the National Security Council, has been there for the last 4 years. In other words, she served both Obama and now Trump, knows Korea very well. Mark Napper, who is our chargé, the acting ambassador in Seoul, has a wealth of experience on the Korean Peninsula and is as fine a Foreign Service officer as you'll ever find. So while I think it's appalling that we don't have an ambassador yet in South Korea, and I think it's appalling that it took us 6 months to get an Assistant Secretary of State at the State Department, we do in fact now have Assistant Secretary of State, both in State and an Assistant Secretary for Asia at Defense, both of whom are highly qualified people who know their job and know Asia. So yes, there's some challenges. I think this is a particularly dangerous time. I find it funny that a lot of the people, and I'm not accusing you here, but a lot of the people who for the last month have been shouting diplomacy, 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 have now said, no, 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 we can't let Trump talk. The reality is the details of any kind of a deal are not going to be made between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. That will be done by the professionals who will sit down with their marching orders and move forward. But the reality in the United States is when we put a policy together, it goes from the bottom up to the top. In North Korea, the policy begins and ends at the top. And without having someone, I had written an article recently saying I thought we should send Rex Tillerson and H.R. McMaster to Pyongyang to talk with Kim Jong-un. You have to talk to him. You have to get his understanding of your concerns, because we don't know. I meet with the North Koreans quite frequently, and I'll be telling them things and they'll be writing it down, and I'll say, surely you know all of this. And they'll say, yes, we do, but we couldn't possibly report this from us. You have to have someone else's name on it. But who knows if the person they're reporting to has the nerve to go into Kim Jong-un and say, you know what, I think our policies are really screwed up. So you really have to have at very high level. Right now, the only American who sat down and talked with Kim Jong-un is Dennis Rodman. That is not my idea of who I want to have negotiating and explaining to the North Koreans what our policy is. So like it or not, Trump is our president. I think he's become very sobered here recently on the realities of the challenge. And I think he has some excellent advisors around him. And we still have a good, deep bench at the State Department and at the Defense Department and the National Security Council in dealing with Korea. And I think we just now need to sort of move forward step by step, understanding that this is a long, drawn-out process. In the meantime, as I tell my friends here in Hawaii, I started off by saying there's a less than 1% chance that we might ever be attacked. If there's a 1% chance of rain, you'll leave your umbrella at home. If there's a 1% chance that if you walk out that door, someone's going to shoot you, you're going to walk out that door. Same odds, same probability. The consequences are much more severe if you're wrong. So I think the state of Hawaii is doing the right thing by preparing for civil defense. God knows they need to do it a lot better. God knows whoever pushes the button to say it's an alert needs to have a second button that says, oops, and get that out. And trust that the lieutenant governor and the governor and all are working very hard to make sure that that kind of an error is never done again or is corrected as soon as it's done. But low probability doesn't mean you shouldn't be prepared. But you shouldn't be panicking either. You ought to leave it to the professionals to make sure that we are prepared in the event of a crisis, and then we need to be more aware of what's happening around us and then sort of go from there. So I probably already talked too long. Why don't we stop here, and we're happy to take the questions.
Great. There is a wireless mic that's Bill, are you there? I can't see. Thanks. Can someone volunteer Gabe will volunteer to be the roving mic person, so if you wouldn't mind talking into the mic when you have your questions. But I think I'm going to start it off by asking the two of you to just engage in a little bit of dialogue, because there's been two quite different views presented here in terms of the urgency, in terms of the likelihood of war and retaliation. So I'm wondering, perhaps Jairus, if you might respond to Ralph, and Ralph, if you might want to engage with Jairus's points more specifically, and then we'll open it up.
Well, I'll start by reminding Ralph that the night we met, which was May 17th, 2016, I asked the then Consulate General of South Korea, Walter Peg, what they plan to do about the future of the alliance, the relationship to China, when Donald Trump won. And Ralph cut me off and said, only an idiot would think there's more than a 0% chance of Trump winning the national election. So I say that as a futurist who says that you prepare for all possibilities as if they are real, because if they become real, then the percentage likelihood of them having happened becomes irrelevant. A 1% chance becomes a 100% chance the day after it happens. And so I think it's a bit irresponsible to think about threats as being similar to previous threats we've had, when we've never had a president who locked people like Mark Knapper and Allison Hooker out of the room for these conversations, who turned policy on a 180-degree pivot point without talking to anyone, and who, in fact, as far as we know, isn't listening to any of the North Korea experts. In fact, last Tuesday, Kelly said that they didn't think they had enough people to staff an envoy, and they were going to outsource any envoy that happened, which means that it may be true that there is a backbench, but I think we have not had a president in a very, very long time who was entirely indifferent to what we mean by expertise, right? Who was seemingly indifferent to the question of facts. And so there's sort of three facts that I think are worth considering. The first is that I want to really push this point that the Nuclear Posture Review that's just come out is a watershed document. We have not seen an aggressive nuclear posture review like this. Even the George W. Bush Nuclear Posture Review was not this aggressive about flexible command and usable nuclear weapons, and most importantly, deploying those nuclear weapons in country, right? Having them in Europe, having them in South Korea, having them in Hawaii, having them in Guam, having them in Okinawa, right? Every time you add those things, my old advisor used to remind me that in the Department of Defense, a successful weapons platform is one that's considered to be 60% effective. We have 6,280 some odd delivery vehicles of nuclear weapons now. 60% containment, that's a lot of loose nuclear weapons. That's not, my point is not to say that nuclear weapons get out all the time or that we should be paranoid about that all the time, but the idea that that entire infrastructure, all of that decision making, all of that strategy would be happening in one single person's judgment is the antithesis of democracy, right? Alexander Hamilton said the US president was never meant to be king. He wasn't even meant to be the governor of New York. And we now have a nuclear king. And I'm just saying we've sort of rolled the dice on that when we thought that king was an enlightened despot. But this particular despot announced in Pennsylvania tonight that he wants to seek the death penalty for drug dealers. Right? He's emulating someone like Duterte. So I think we should, there are lots of historical examples we could draw to things like other earlier forms of coercive diplomacy. We could draw historical sort of analogies to instances in which we used pressure, we pushed things to the brink. But those were examples where with the Soviet Union, we had thousands of diplomats on each side. We had exchanged embassies. We had a hotline so they could talk to one another when this was taking place. And we had competent people that were allowed in the room. I mean, I would wish for a Curtis LeMay right now. Because, again, so I want, there's a tendency in international relations, and we do this all the time, and it's part of our job, we should tell everybody, don't worry, let the professionals take care of it. The professionals aren't in the room. In fact, the professionals are talking about how it's the worst job they've ever had. And the professionals are also dropping like flies. So I think we have to start talking about what it means to not have constitutional checks and balances, right? The very thing that Ralph said that we can trust, which is checks and balances. We don't have checks and balances. We have personalities. We have trust or faith that people wouldn't take illegal orders. But it's just not true that they need congressional oversight before they start hitting targets. It's certainly not true that they need something like an authorization of force. And I'll just remind everybody how quickly Iraq got started, how quickly it got off the ground. After the failed attempt to get the United Nations to admit that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. We have already confirmed with the United Nations, we already have an international agreement that North Korea has provided weapons of mass destruction to Syria. All of the legal argument we need for imminent threat, as it was interpreted by John Yoo under the Bush administration, is present. So that doesn't mean we should all be running around, panicking, but it does mean that we have an institutional crisis. We have a constitutional failure, right? We have no means for accessing those decision makers. And we have no one to tell them to, put Mark Napper in a room or go and actually find someone who knows about the situation. That can't happen right now. So for me, that's dire, even if the missiles aren't somehow already on the way. That's more than a 1% if there's a guy outside with a gun. It's, there's definitely a guy outside with a gun, and he doesn't like to listen to anybody. And he has the authority to pull the trigger without asking anybody if he should do it. And granted, a two-star general has to accept that command. But what we're saying when we say that, what we're saying is that democracy rests on a coup d'etat. We're saying that we have to trust that the military chain of command will refuse to follow an order. And that fits no definition of democracy I've ever known. So for me, that's where the crisis is. This isn't about North Korea. This is about the corrosion, right, of institutional processes.
So Rob, do you want to just have a little response?
First of all, I still don't think the sky is falling. I understand, and I don't. We both want the same thing, which is no war, and we're both trying to move in that direction. I've spent a lot of time actually with the people who wrote the Nuclear Posture Review. Trump did not write the Nuclear Posture Review. I'd be willing to bet he's never read it, other than the opening paragraph, which I think they threw in "Make America Great Again," so that you can sign on the bottom. It was written by the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, who was the primary author of it, his office. But it was an interagency process, as those documents are, and so it's put out throughout the interagency. Nuclear Posture Reviews, starting with George W. Bush, have argued that nuclear weapons are a last resort weapon, and this one doesn't change that. So from that standpoint, there isn't a significant change. What has changed, what they've argued has changed in the world, is that Russia is once again going from a benign threat to a more substantial threat, and that there is a need for us to focus on modernizing, not increasing the number of nuclear weapons, but modernizing those forces. I've heard nothing that would indicate that anybody is planning on nuclear tests anytime soon, and certainly not atmospheric tests. I think it's downright irresponsible, actually, to start frightening people in the South Pacific that we're going to start with atmospheric tests again. That's nonsense. So no one's going to do that, and no president who did that would last in office very long. And again, I have more faith in our system than that. What does concern me in the Nuclear Posture Review is the argument that we need to have, quote, more credible weapons in order to enhance deterrence. And the counter-argument, of course, is if you have these low-yield weapons, it also might be more tempting to use them. I think there is a serious debate that needs to be had on that. I also understand one of the realities in Washington, and that's that all of these kind of documents are in fact wish lists, but the nuclear modernization plan that is called for in the NPR would require spending on nuclear forces to go from the current 3.5% of the Pentagon's budget to 7% of the Pentagon's budget. I haven't done the math, but I know 7% of the Pentagon's budget is bigger than the gross national product of probably half the countries in the world. And if they were to put that other 3.5% toward nuclear forces, it has to come out of somebody else's pocket. And there'll still be the congressman insisting that we build C-130s in Georgia and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm somewhat concerned by this emphasis on lower yield weapons, and I think we need to have a debate on how necessary that is and how reliable it is, and really, in fact, whether or not we need to spend the kind of money that we're spending on nuclear forces, on forces that we know will never be used or should never be used, rather than conventional forces that have more of a need. So I think there's a useful debate there, but it doesn't start with Armageddon. It starts with looking at the policies and sort of understanding where they're driven. I don't think that anyone in today's military is a Curtis LeMay in the worst sense of that term. I know many of the senior leaders, and again, I have a great faith in them. I do think they are concerned about both the growing Chinese nuclear arsenal and the Russian nuclear arsenal, and the fact that both China and Russia are in fact revisionist powers who have challenged the United States in many different ways. To me, the most serious of which has been the attack on our democracy and the cyber threat. And that's one thing we're working on in Pacific Forum right now, is trying to A, understand the nature of the cyber threat, and then B, looking at ways to get around it. To me, it's a much bigger threat than the nuclear threat. I guess our basic fundamental difference is I don't think that we're run by a bunch of madmen who are looking for an excuse to destroy someone else or the world with nuclear weapons. I think the likelihood of using nuclear weapons is still extremely low, and there was nothing in the nuclear posture review that promoted the use of nuclear weapons or to have it as anything other than a last resort. I've also argued for many years that we need a no first use of weapons of mass destruction policy. The reality is the US and most civilized nations have gotten rid of their chemical and biological agents, but some countries have kept them, and nuclear forces could deter their use. So a WMD, no first use policy, I think would make a lot of sense. Passing a law that says you cannot use nuclear weapons is wonderful. You know, we have the nuclear ban treaty that our friends in New Zealand and others have been putting forth. I would have much preferred that they ban the use of nuclear weapons rather than the possession of them. But let's say that ban goes into fact, and what are they going to do? Take Putin and Trump and France and Germany, or not Germany, excuse me, France and the UK, and China and everyone else, and put them in jail. So there's legislation that feels good, and then there's legislation that does good. I'm much more in favor of the legislation that actually does good, rather than a lot of the meaningless things that we get out of Congress that make them feel better, but which really don't have any practical impact.
Okay, let's open this up because I don't know about you, but I'm confused. So, questions, please. And Mary here has the mic. And please let the speakers know who you're addressing your questions to.
I have a question for Ms. Costa. I know you're working for a think tank that you guys sift through a lot of information and data and draw conclusions and think about probabilities to various scenarios. When you throw out a number like 1%, I assume that you've arrived at that through a rational process. You're not just throwing a number out. I'm hoping that you could sort of briefly explain to us and reassure us that that actually is a real number, because it's a really negligible number, and that'd be great if it was true. So.
Thank you. In fact, my friends in Washington have criticized me for saying less than 1% because today it's 0%, because the North Koreans have yet to demonstrate the capability of even putting a nuclear weapon on an ICBM, getting it through the atmosphere, both out and back without burning up, and then hitting anywhere within 60 to 100 kilometers of the target. This is what the assessment is based on, the demonstrated capabilities of the North Koreans. Now, the North Koreans will show you videos of their missiles destroying the White House and et cetera, and anybody can make a video. But the technical assessments are that they still haven't, and they certainly haven't demonstrated that capability. a threat is capability times intention. Right now, of course, we're in the sort of peace offensive era. The main thing that I think went through a lot of people's minds, at least went through my mind, when we got that alert saying this is not an alert, is of all the times when North Koreans might be tempted to do something, certainly when they're in the middle of a peace offensive, when we're trying to open doors and getting ready for the Olympics, it just didn't make sense. So obviously there's something amiss here with a warning like that. The North Koreans are not suicidal. They have said that the reason they have nuclear weapons is to prevent us from attacking them. They're paranoid. They're very paranoid about that. So they also understand that were they to ever fire a nuclear weapon or even fire a regular missile against the United States, that the response would be overwhelming and cataclysmic for them. One of the things that, quite frankly, annoys me is I continually hear people make reference to the new Cuban Missile Crisis. I happen to be old enough to remember the first Cuban Missile Crisis. I was in college at the time. There were two nuclear weapon states, both with the capability of not only destroying one another, but destroying mankind 5 or 6 times over. And there was a threat of using those weapons. That was a Cuban Missile Crisis. Here you have a country that might have 1 or 2 weapons that they might be able to fire and might be able to hit someone, after which case they would be essentially wiped from the face of the earth. This is a problem. It's not the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we sort of, again, need to put that into perspective. At the end of the day, it's a judgment call, and I agree with you. Someone else could put 5%. I thought there was a very small chance that Trump would win. My wife actually corrected me first. She said, "You don't watch social media. If you did that, you'd understand what's going on." But that's not my specialty. This area is a little bit more my specialty, and that's my best guess. When it comes to North Korea, we're all guessing, and actually, we have to always remember that.
So Jairus, if you could just add some comments about that.
Just something quick. I mean, I think the reason why people make the comparison to the Cuban Missile Crisis is mathematical. So we had 2 countries. They were of similar capability at the time. And there was a crisis over where weapons would be placed in a third-party country that had no nuclear weapons. What we have is actually potentially much worse. And if you watched Putin's crazy hypersonic missile display, you know that when we're talking about the potentiality of an escalating conflict in North Korea, so where a conflict actually breaks out, we have the possibility to draw in China and Russia, who are both vastly more powerful than Russia was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Russia has said any attack on a country they consider an ally, they consider a nuclear attack on their soil. China has also leaked that they have a security agreement with North Korea, which will obligate them legally to come to North Korea's aid. No one plans on a world war. So my point is not that we're on a world war happens tomorrow. It's that we've done dumber things with worse consequences in much, more controlled situations than what we have right now. So I think it's, again, right, it's not about North Korea, it's about the fact that we have a very reckless transition of power at a moment where we have 3 very powerful nuclear powers, all of which I agree are revisionist in the sense that they all want a different kind of international order. All right, Xi has a different vision of the international order. Putin has a different vision of the international order. The United States doesn't seem to be able to make up its mind on what it wants the international order to be. And we have Japan losing faith. We have South Korea losing faith. The senior minister to the president went on PBS last week and said that their greatest fear right now is unilateral U.S. action, right? Which suggests that people in positions of power who know the peninsula pretty well are concerned that they can't count on our behavior. And so to me, that's the Cuban Missile Crisis to the power of 3 when we start thinking about the game theory of how every actor in the system reacts. That doesn't mean that we're as close as we were once we got those, U2 images. It means that planning is going to require a tremendous amount more knowledge and expertise. And That's only going to come if we demand it, right? That's not going to find its way through the process. I just don't have Ralph's faith that the people who are making the major decisions, which will affect the alliance system for the next 50 years, know what they're doing, right? Mattis is an impressive military thinker. McMaster is an impressive military thinker. They have no diplomatic or strategic experience. I've talked to 15 different people who were at the State Department who served under one of the two of them at one point in time or the other, and they said, I respect them to the end of the day and I follow them into battle. I would not want them defining U.S. policy. So again, right, this is not the same. For me, these are apples and oranges, historically speaking. And I think it requires more of us as a populace to say, we want to be in the room, right? We want to have the kinds of things that, to cite a Republican, that John McCain did during the Iraq War. McCain went and did his own fact-finding missions because it was clear the Bush administration was lying. He had to get on a plane, he went to the Green Zone, he did it, pissed off the State Department. We should expect the same thing from our Congress people, that we are making sure that we are getting consistent information from an administration who, to use the cyber example, refuses to spend $1 of the cyber budget, right, that's been given to the State Department to stop Russian interference. Does not spend $1. Jane Mayer tracked this down, it was in the New Yorker. They were given a substantial budget to do counter efforts to prevent future Russian interference, and they will not spend a single dollar, which suggests that they're not rational actors. Maybe it's that I understand the rationality, but it doesn't coincide with the rationality that I understand. So again, I think when we have similar interests, I also think a new first use policy is a great place to start. But I have a lot less trust in the system to produce that. Not because they're madmen, because it's not their job.
I see a couple of hands up.
Yeah,
One
right
in the front here, Doug,
Yeah.
and then all the way to the back.
Hi, Doug Mutz. Okay, you can hold it. I'm trying to live stream this. I'm kind of, oh, thank you. Yeah, you can have. My name's Doug Motzok. I'm old enough to have lived through witnessing one of the last Pacific nuclear tests, I think 1962. I was in New Valley, and everyone walked out and watched that. I'm also experienced the recent false alarm, and I live in Alewa, so I didn't get out of bed. I figure if 150 kiloton blast went off, I'd be vaporized. There's no time even to have a shot of whiskey and a cigar. The threat is, the discussion people have is different here than it is in the rest of the United States. I mean, they're not talking in the same way about the nuclear threat in Korea, in Vermont, or Florida than they're having here. My question to both of you is, how much of the threat to Hawaii is due to the incredible large militarization of Hawaii that makes it a nuclear target? Thank you.
Yeah, quite frankly, if I was a North Korean military planner and had the ability, which I don't believe they have yet, but had the ability to strike anywhere on the earth, probably the first place I would strike would be Guam, quite frankly, because that's where our strategic assets are, and that's the assets that create the biggest threat.
That doesn't make me feel any better.
No, I'm not trying to make you feel better. I'm trying to give you an honest answer to the question. After that, probably the national command authorities in Washington. If you have an unlimited number of nuclear weapons like the Russians do, well, you probably have Hawaii somewhere on your target list. If you have 3 or 4 nuclear weapons or capability of shooting them like North Korea does, I would think Hawaii is actually a low priority target. Now, the one thing that I know, and I grew up in a place called Newburgh, New York, which I'm sure you've never even heard of, about 60 miles off the Hudson from New York City. And we had a strategic air command base, Air Force base there. And we were convinced that we were one of the top 3 targets for the Soviet Union if there was going to be a war. And just about every place I went in the United States, they were convinced they were one of the top 3 targets of the Soviet Union in a nuclear war. So I understand how we can
Well,
can
there's
see-
precedent here. Pearl Harbor, I don't
Yeah.
have to mention that, right?
Pearl Harbor, of course, there was certainly a logic behind that from the Japanese standpoint, because they assumed that we were coming into the war, and that's where our assets, all of the military hardware was at the time. And the Japanese, strategically, or at least tactically, were very smart to go after those assets in Pearl Harbor. It took us about 6 months to recover from that, to ultimately defeat them anyway. Strategically, it turned out not to be a good idea. But from that kind of a military logic, Hawaii is a command headquarters, and if there's a war on the Korean Peninsula, the commands are going to come either from Seoul, from the United Nations Command, or from Washington. So as important as I think we are here, from a planning standpoint, I don't see Hawaii as being a very big target, quite frankly. If I was a North Korean planner, I'm not a North Korean planner, so I can't tell you how they think, but that's what I would see.
I think we should also talk about the long-term consequences, though. So if we continue to sort of approach massive pressure, right, this sort of like maximum pressure backed up by usable nuclear weapons, and we follow that path down the sort of logic that we've already assumed China is going to take, right, which China will of course respond to and reciprocate. Then the problem won't be above-ground nuclear testing, which I agree will never happen again. We'll use subcritical nuclear testing, right? But we will take over more of these islands. We'll take over more of Wuhan. We'll take over, I mean, there's not much more left to take, but we'll be using more of it consistently to test interceptors, to store nuclear weapons. And that footprint is substantial, right? We are running out of water on these islands. These islands are losing their capacity to make fresh water. And that water is at the same time being poisoned by larger and larger installations. And so it's not just a question of how do we deal with this crisis in the next couple of months. It's the way that this crisis will then, if it goes well, right, if Ralph is right and everything goes into place, here's the message that sends to the world. The same message after George W. Bush tried to modernize our nuclear arsenal, which is that we're going to pursue an offensive nuclear arsenal. So Russia put strategic bombers back up into the air for the first time. China invested money in mobile lifters, right? Russia started building the capacity for nuclear submarines again. Russia, in response to that original modernization, just deployed the first nuclear submarine that's a drone, right? That has 100 megaton capability, right? That infrastructure is going to be on this island. And that's not going to be the happy-go-lucky infrastructure of Shafter or Pearl Harbor. That will get bigger and bigger and bigger as those needs get bigger and bigger, and we'll have more runoff and we'll have more problems. So I think we shouldn't say that, right, if we get lucky and everything works out, then that means everything worked out. I'll point you, the Congressional Research Office just published the first full report on what nuclear runoff from mining and milling, from storage, from testing, did to the United States. And they now estimate the death toll at 300,000. That's the federal government's numbers. I'm not saying we're going to have testing on this island, but I think that shows that when you trust the people in power to make rational decisions about national security, killing 300,000 Americans through reckless uranium mining, milling, testing, storage, waste storage, and other kinds of decisions means that they're rationally willing to kill 300,000 people. I think that's something we should take very seriously. I think that's evidence that there needs to be more democratic control of the process. That's all because the 1954 Atomic Energy Act put the entire nuclear industry, the building of the weapons, the mining, the development of the capacities under the executive branch. Right? It's not how the Constitution is supposed to work. And I think we will, and Wuhan will, and Okinawa will, right, and South Korea will bear the brunt of that. And that's, for me, that means a bomb doesn't ever have to go off for this to be a catastrophe.
So a couple more questions in the back. Person back there, and then Gay. Right. Yep, I see you. Yep.
Hi there, my name is Gary. My remark is to the Lieutenant Governor. I got the alert from my phone. I was working on a piece of machinery, and I tried to duck and take cover, but it didn't work too well. So I'm dead. So I'm really wondering about why. What are we going to do? Are we going to build some kind of glass cover over the island and said, we're now okay. I don't know, just, and by the way, I think if Allende in Chile was a little bit more suspicious, he's probably going to be alive today and not overthrown by a friendly government. Thank you.
Mike, sure.
Billy, thanks a lot for your question. I mean, I think we all agree that was a terrible incident that occurred. If anything, is probably the reason why the crowd is as big as it is. And not only have we had the year where we've had a lot of reasons to be concerned, but then we had that incident take place. And it's very unfortunate. Hopefully, it's not even hopefully, I think the government has been taking a lot of steps to be able to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, there's a question back there. Gabe? And then Adam.
It's actually a follow-up to Gilly's. Are there plans on like shelters, interceptors? Can any of you talk about that for here?
Good question.
So,
I mean, first of all, as I said, North Koreans today are not even capable of doing this. So while we need to be prepared and we need to be looking at worst case analysis, we shouldn't confuse worst case with likely case or become panicked. I don't think we have an assured capability of shooting anything down. On the other hand, they don't have an assured capability of reaching here in the first place. I'd be more worried if I was a whale than if I was sitting here on the island of Oahu, quite frankly, just given the accuracies and all. It's also, not to talk light of this, but most nuclear warheads are not huge, massive things, but even the bigger ones are not going to destroy this entire island. If Pearl Harbor were attacked and hit, you would not want to be living in Pearl City. But if you're up in Manoa Valley, you might not even know what happened until you turn on the news.
So the seismic effect.
Well,
I mean, the fallout within 6 hours, you would know what happened.
You'll hear the noise, you'll hear all of that. But what I'm saying is, people seem to think if a nuclear weapon went off at Pearl Harbor, that everyone on the island of Oahu or in the state of Hawaii is going to be instantly vaporized. And that's not the case either. And that's why people are told just go into your basement, close your windows, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is still that the probability of something like this happening is extremely low. I don't lose a lot of sleep. I lose a lot more sleep over a lot of other things than that. And I don't think that we do a service to the people of Hawaii if we sit here trying to make people frightened to the fact that nuclear war is imminent and an attack on Hawaii is imminent, because the facts just don't bear that out.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say two things. The first is, this isn't the first nuclear crisis with North Korea, and nor is it the last nuclear crisis in North Korea, and it's going to happen with China too if we keep pursuing these kinds of policies. Hawaii is going to be at the center of, you know, what Obama called the Asian pivot. I'd much rather resources be put into preventing those conflicts from happening in the first place than trying to get deep underground on an island that doesn't even have basements. I'm sure that's why you're all laughing. It's like, who has a basement in Hawaii? You know, I was on the second floor and I wasn't afraid of being vaporized. I was afraid of watching my kids crap their pants to death, right? Like, that's the image I saw when I grew up with the Cold War, which was the radiation. Thinking about how this island is going to feed itself and have water if boats can't come because we're in the middle of a conflict, right? When we think about sustainability and dealing with crises in Hawaii, we shouldn't be thinking about a bomb going off. We should be thinking about the fact that if there's a major naval conflict with China in any limited capacity, getting enough stuff to this island so that we can all eat, have water, have fuel to clean water, have electricity, that these things are actually real concerns that we should think about. And this is, for me, this is a kind of miner's canary, right? One, that the mainland will mostly not notice while it's happening. Like, they've mostly not noticed that this was happening. Right? Because again, have one leak about Jared Kushner and you're going to push this off the lines. But the second is that interceptors are kind of a joke. Not because we couldn't get them to work, but because any peer competitor would modernize to make sure that once they work, they wouldn't work for very long. And it's much easier to create countermeasures. Brigadier General J.F.C. Fuller called it the constant tactical factor. He said over the long history of military affairs, countermeasures almost always win, right? Because the actual systems have to be perfect. The countermeasure only has to work once. So yeah, I think we should be concerned, but I think that's why we should be thinking about the security environment. And also what we do if it's not a bomb, it's just a disruption. If it's a cyber attack. And I don't mean by North Korea, I mean because Russia and the United States have finally gotten into it. They want to start shutting things down just to show that they can, right? Those kinds of vulnerabilities are things that we should be part of the discussion of. We shouldn't leave to so-called experts, right? We should become experts in the ability to feed ourselves, have enough water, push diplomacy as a real option, right? And there are plenty of people struggling to do those things, and they've been doing it since the end of the Korean War. And we've mostly let them do it by themselves. And I think it's time that we start helping out, right? Joining in, noticing.
And I have no argument with any of that. I guess the only difference between the two of us is the sense of urgency. And while I don't think you need to dismiss the threat, I don't think you need to be digging a hole in your backyard anytime real soon and worrying about it. So I think we need to have a little cooler assessment of what the threat is and how to deal with it. And then we should be calling on our public officials to take these threats seriously. And I think, again, that's somewhere where you and I both agree.
Yeah, we have time for a few more questions. I've got 3 hands that I'm aware of already. Adam, I think I saw you first. And then you, yeah, and then you.
After the Trump convention meeting was announced, the word denuclearization was thrown around for a little while, and that seems very unlikely to me, but I was hoping to hear from you about, is there any possibility of North Korea denuclearizing willingly or unwillingly?
Yeah, I think we have to, first of all, we have to pay very close attention to what the North Koreans have said. The North Koreans for years have said they're prepared to denuclearize. Once America ends its hostile policy, and ending the hostile policy means removing all your forces from the Korean Peninsula, ending the alliance, removing the nuclear umbrella, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is not will the North Koreans denuclearize, but at what cost? And is it a cost that we're willing to pay? That's what we need to find out from the North Koreans. They have essentially put into their constitution that they are a nuclear weapon state. So the cost of getting them to denuclearize are going to be pretty heavy. All we've been really trying to do at this point is to get them to agree to the principle that denuclearization is an end goal. This is where we were in 2005 before the North Koreans walked away from the joint agreement from the 6-party talks. If we can get back to there and then start a step-by-step process, I think that's useful. But I don't think anyone who understands the situation or understands North Koreans believe that denuclearization is a near-term likelihood. This is still going to be the long-term goal, but we want to work toward that eventuality, and in the meantime, continue deterrence and continue to make sure that those nuclear weapons are never used. We have never threatened to nuke North Korea, for that matter. Both sides have said, if we are attacked, then we will respond, Trump says, with fire and fury. North Korea says, turning Seoul into a sea of fire, et cetera, et cetera. But they're very careful to, we don't need to use nuclear weapons to destroy North Korea, and they understand that. And they don't need to use nuclear weapons to destroy Seoul. There are 25 million South Koreans within artillery range of North Korea. So these are the real stakes that are involved. Denuclearization, we just want to make sure it's on the table as an end goal. If the U.S. were to agree to deal with North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, this would destroy the non-proliferation treaty. It would more than likely encourage South Koreans, perhaps the Japanese, more than likely the Taiwanese and others, that they need to go down the nuclear path as well, because there really are no consequences. And that, I think, would sound a death toll toward the proliferation regime. That's, I think, one of the real concerns we have, and one of the reasons why you hear people saying we don't recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, even though we obviously recognize that they have nuclear weapons.
This may be one moment where Ralph is actually more idealistic than I am. I think the NPT is in its most brittle state that it's ever been in. And I think breaking the ABM treaty under the Bush administration and developing missile interceptors and the capacity for a real NMD and kicking off now a second wave of nuclear modernization means that all our peer competitor states are going to start modernizing, and most of the people who relied on our alliance after this most recent go-around are not going to trust our alliance very much. I'd be shocked if South Korea is not thinking about what China could be as an alternative to the United States. I'd be shocked if Japan wasn't considering now in a way that they haven't considered before. The United States might not show up if they were in a conflict with China, Russia, or North Korea, and that they may need their own nuclear weapons. So I think we're at risk, short of a major effort to rebuild the NPT, from those things already happening. The second thing I would say, and I think this is actually very, very important, is that the denuclearization talk is premised on the idea that we would ever be able to politically say we're not going to overthrow the North Korean government. And I don't know that Trump can hold it together long enough to do that, and I'm not sure he can put together a Republican coalition that would support it. And I think that if he shows up in Pyongyang, obviously he's not going to go there, but maybe he will, who knows. He surprised me before. I would be shocked if Trump had the political capability to give the necessary security assurances such that if I were North Korea, I wouldn't want nuclear weapons, right? I just think those security assurances are not politically viable right now, and so presuming they're just going to kind of show up and therefore will be delivered is a pretty low likelihood. Bolton is the most aggressive version of that, but there are certainly many others. I mean, Graham, I do not think is on board with giving security assurances. I don't think Japan is on board with us giving security assurances. And I wouldn't say we have the best bargaining hand right now to work that out. So I mean, we are starting from scratch in a way that I don't think we've started in a long time. And that makes the fact that Trump is even talking about denuclearization, I interpret that more to mean he's looking for a way to not have the meeting at all, right? Because it's such an unrealistic goal that it seems like he's already trying to create the alibi for not showing up in May.
There seems to be a disconnect to me between not wanting Trump to talk about denuclearization and wanting to get rid of nuclear weapons.
Right. I agree. I just don't think Congress people understand that difference, unfortunately.
And I guess one reason I'm an optimist is, I studied international relations at Syracuse University in 1965, all right? And the books I was reading then said that by the end of the century, there would be 40 to 50 nuclear weapon states. Today, there's still, you can count them pretty much on one hand, maybe one finger left over or extra depending on how you count. So while I worry about the NPT, I also think that it's actually had a much more successful run than we thought. And my sense is, talking to people in Japan and Korea, that after the Trump visit to both of those places, they came away more secure, not less secure, in the U.S. commitment and in the faith in the alliance. And that is critical to those countries not developing nuclear weapons. And in my view, I think fewer nuclear weapons and fewer nuclear weapon states is better than more. So I'm all in favor of promoting those alliances and trying to reassure our allies that extended deterrence is still there. And there are a lot of people that are working very hard to make sure that that's the case.
Yeah, before we get to the next question, which is you, I just wanted to point out that a petition is circulating. If you haven't had a chance to sign it yet, it's a petition from Hawaii J20 in support of the Ho'okipa bill that is currently in the... Oh, I'm sorry. Wrong hat. It's actually a petition calling for to take back nuclear war powers from the U.S. president and adopt a no first use policy. So it's specific to this topic. Thanks, Gabe. If you haven't signed already, please do. And your question?
Aloha. name is Bok Dong. I'm a Korean reunification activist, and I'm a member of the Better for Peace. There are 2 points I'd like to make. One is that I'm kind of surprised and disappointed there was not another speaker, a third speaker, because to be on the top podium.
Third speaker could make it.
Well, no, Christina. She's the person I'm speaking to. She's an activist in the Korea peace movement, and she would have been an excellent counterbalance to what has been discussed, because both of you seem to talk very similar regarding militaristic agenda.
That's right. That's right.
Whether it's building it up or ignoring it, but still continuing the issue of nuclear weapons. So Korea has the United States has from what I understand, over 1,000 plus nuclear weapons above, around, and inside the Korean Peninsula on the south side of Korea. And that is a danger. No, it is. It's true. And even though back in the early 1990s, there was, I think, one of the past presidents had mentioned that all nuclear weapons had been withdrawn. I don't believe that at all. I think it would continue. It's still there. There's point 2 also is that one thing that hasn't been discussed is that a peace treaty. Why not call for a peace treaty? And of course, in order to have a peace treaty between the United States and Korea, Mr. Kosa, of course, chastised me and asked for saying that South Korea and North Korea should be talking together, and when it should be the United States. And I think all parties should be talking in that regards. But my feeling is that part of that peace treaty talk is to call for the complete withdrawal of U.S. military in the South Korean.
Absolutely.
South Korea.
Yes.
And also, the government such as that, which is a threat to the Asia-Pacific region, and so I can see why China is a little threatened, because those THAADs are not just pointing at the north, they're also pointing towards China. So that's a complete threat, and I'd like to hear what you all have to say.
Yeah, I think Christine does incredible work. Part of the reason why I agreed to do this was because I'm tired of this being about North Korea. I don't think this is a problem of North Korea's behavior. If another country that was vastly more powerful said they were going to overthrow our country, I think we would do all the same things. That's not a defense of their internal politics, but I'm just saying nothing North Korea has done is in any way irrational. But we're entering a period of U.S. irrationality, which is unprecedented. And for whatever reason, we can only talk about whether or not North Korea is or is not a threat. We seem almost incapable of talking about why the United States is a threat, why Russia has the credibility to modernize their military so much, which has a lot to do with U.S. provocations under George W. Bush. We know that China is pursuing more nuclear weapons and better nuclear weapons precisely because of the interceptors. And if North Korea wasn't the cause for the interceptors, I promise the United States would find another reason to get interceptors to Asia. They'd find another reason to get interceptors to Europe. We're driving a global nuclear arms race. We are the driver. Now, people could say, oh, well, now that it's off to the races, we might as well win. I think that is an entirely irresponsible position. I would love for U.S. forces to be out of South Korea. I would love for them to be out of Wuhan. I would love for them to be out of Okinawa. I would love for them to be out of Hawaii. I don't think we're going to do that for as long as those policies and those capabilities are in the least democratic office in the United States. The only one that is not accountable to popular elections is chosen by electors. The only one who is a single person, right? Meaning there's no other checks and balances within their decision-making process. Right? We have no other institution like that in the United States. And we've chosen the least democratic, the most capable of error, to be the one that has the most danger for the rest of the world. And I think we should start taking responsibility for that. So I would love and welcome and support another full panel that's just on the efforts in South Korea. But I think that that's a way of displacing our responsibility, right? As a U.S. system that claims to be a democracy and has a nuclear dictatorship. Right? We have a nuclear dictatorship when it comes to decision-making about nuclear weapons. We have a nuclear dictator. And if we can't start saying that out loud and then have some kind of conversation of what it means to change that fact, then unfortunately, all of the peace movements in all of the places that you have named will be incapable of winning the war that will be necessary to push the United States out. And that's a war I would be on the other side of, to be perfectly frank. If Wuhan had the capacity to say no more, I would be on their side. Because it's an imposition of the worst kind. But we can't even have that debate. We can't have that discussion because it's by experts, all within the executive, which Congress reviews maybe every 10 years. I mean, when was the last nuclear audit? It was 15 years ago. Right? We don't even ask. And I promise you, right, that, I mean, I hate to say that, like, oh, there's one issue that always comes first, but, like, we either take this power back and we have constitutional checks and balances in a real democracy, or we're constantly going to be playing catch-up to 7% of the Department of Defense budget, right? Billions of dollars. And I guess I think that's a fight worth having, right? If we're really serious about decolonization, if we're really serious about sovereignty and autonomy, then we have to be really serious if there is one country that's used these weapons ever. And there's one country who started the race over again after the Cold War. And that's our country, for those of us who claim to be U.S. citizens. So we have to take responsibility for that.
Well, I'm all in favor of a serious debate. I wish it would be fact-based. I think that if you start off the debate by accusing the guy that you're dealing with as a nuclear dictator, you've probably already sort of soured the discussion.
That was actually Arthur Schlesinger's line,
yeah,
not mine.
Well, I just heard you using it, and I'm saying that I don't think that's the best approach to trying to talk rationally with anyone with this administration. If you believe there are still nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula, U.S. nuclear weapons, then there's probably not much we can talk about. I do not believe that, and I think the facts speak to that, but I'm sure there are lots of suspicions. I will say that the U.S. has made an effort to promote a peace treaty on the Korean Peninsula. There was at one time, I'm sure you recall, the four-party talks that were aimed exactly at that. And the reason they fell apart was not because of anything that happened in Washington. It was because the North Koreans refused to accept the South Koreans as a sovereign equal. The day that the North Koreans still to this day will not refer to South Korea as the Republic of Korea. If the North and the South sit down and want to have a peace treaty together, they could have that. And there wouldn't be an awful lot that the US or China or anyone else would be able to do to undermine that. That ball has always been in their court. And the US view, and certainly the view that I've taken with the North Koreans, is the road to Washington runs through Seoul. And we now have a leader in Seoul that's trying to take a more active role, and I give him great credit for that. Kim Dae-jung, to me, was a personal hero. I thought he had the right idea with the Sunshine Policy, but he didn't apply it as effectively as he could have. He also said that for South Korea to be secure and for a unified Korea to be secure, it needed to have a continued security relationship with the United States as the outside balancer. Why? Because when Koreans look around, there's China, there's Russia, there's Japan. If Korea were in the middle of Europe, they'd be Germany. But unfortunately, geography wasn't kind to them. And that view, that strategic view in Korea is that if you're the, quote, shrimp among whales, it's good to have an outside power as one of your allies. That's been the decision by the Korean people. You recall there was a time when Philippine government said, we don't want the US here anymore, and we left. And the Filipinos to this day say, why did you go? Why did you go? We didn't really want you to go, we just wanted you to pay us more. South Koreans have that debate. If that decision is reached in South Korea to end the alliance, we'd have no option other than to leave. But the overwhelming majority of people in South Korea support the alliance, see the need for that security blanket, because the North Koreans to them are still a hostile power that believes that they're the rightful owner of the entire peninsula. And that's what the security treaty is all about. You can argue that one way or the other. I've been involved in technical briefings to the Chinese on the THAAD system that show that THAAD has no capability against China in the areas that the Chinese are worried about. That's a fact-based discussion. If you want to then turn around with no facts and say, oh, but we all know it's aimed at China, it's very hard to have a discussion. Get the facts and then we can talk about the capabilities of THAAD. But I've seen the technical briefings, and I don't see THAAD as a threat to China. The Chinese were trying to test the South Koreans to see whether or not they would start obeying the Middle Kingdom or not, and then they started punishing South Korea because it didn't. That, to me, says much more about Chinese attitudes than it does about the U.S., South Korea, or THAAD. Thank you.
It seems like that is situated on the west coast, is it? Of
Yeah.
Korea, which faces towards China.
I'll say one thing that Ralph and I agree on is that exaggerating the value of that only improves the argument for putting more money into national missile defense. The reason why China's not afraid of it is it doesn't work. It's the largest boondoggle in U.S. history. We should, I mean, I'm not saying that I want it there. I'm just telling you that when we make the argument that it works and that China feels deterred by it, I think we lend credibility to exactly the reason we want to dump billions of dollars into it. And we shouldn't. It's an irresponsible system. It's provocatory, I agree, but it doesn't deter China, and China doesn't think so either. They have a better interceptor system, according to their most recent demonstration, than we do. And that's our fault, right? We have created a world where everybody wants an interceptor system now.
Korean people don't want that.
Of course, I think it should be gone, but I'm just saying it shouldn't be gone because it works. It should be gone because it's an imposition, and it is a gigantic waste of money.
And they get
threat.
it.
We should be facts on it. It does not work. It does not save anyone except for Raytheon.
So I know this is not going to be very popular, but we're at 7:45, and the church has asked us to be out the door by 8 p.m. So that gives us 15 minutes to clean up. So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to shut down the Q&A at this time. But thank you.
No, I know Goodyear was invited, and she had to go to a Ford Foundation event on the Big Island.
But there is not
She's not.
right now. We are not saying that. They are not saying that. To just address something really. We never address them. With all the respect, you know, and we listened, we were asked to come here to listen to your perspective with the understanding that Kanakamo'oli would be allowed to speak here and give their perspective. And this was part of the reason why, it was because then our voices would then be relegated to a secondary voice, a secondary place where, you know, the only Korean who has spoken here today the focus has been focused on facts. Your perspective is lacking in fact-based. And so part of the reason why is the concerns of why we wanted to have Christine on here, why we wanted to have Kanakamo'oli here, is because as far as war is going on, as far as aggression is going on, as far as paranoia as we're talking about, the focus of saying North Korea is a paranoid nation, when in reality 85% of their land was carpet bombed by the United States, that the vast majority of people in America did not know that 25 to 30% of their population was decimated by America, and don't even remember that there was a North Korean war, and that there was the people themselves, schools, hospitals, that was something that was created, and that is not something that's based upon paranoia, that is something that is based upon fact. And that is part of the reason why having somebody who comes from a Korean perspective that was put that first was something that was really important. The other thing about Kanakamo'oli voices here is the fact that the war is happening here today. The aggression that they're talking about, when they're talking about fire and fury, they've already allocated more monies. They've already had a joint discussion from all the branches of the military here in Hawaii that already has 25% for land base here on Oahu, in which they're already saying they've already agreed to have more missile testing out of PMR. They already agreed to talking about building up the Hakuloa training area, which is the same Ankupua of Mauna Kea. They've already cracked the water table in Koho'olawe, and they're looking at an area that's larger than Koho'olawe and building up all of that area for military aggression in preparation so-called for Korea, against North Korea. They're utilizing this paranoia and fear that especially got built around January and the false missile crisis alert that happened. And this is things that are happening right now and here in Hawaii. And so when we're looking at what's going to happen over there, are they going to crack the water table for the island of Hawaii? That's something that we have very real concerns about. At the same time, they made a decision, they said that they might actually open up Mokua again for the longest time.
That's right.
They haven't
That's
had-
right.
They made a decision that they're saying, we're thinking about opening up Mokua for live results, live fire practices as well. In addition to that, you know, where are all these billions of dollars going? The billions of dollars are going to go, a lot of it into mobilizing here. You know, they're talking about closing the Marine Corps base as well. And instead, now they're pumping into millions of dollars into building it up higher. And so, you know, I aloha you guys for all the manao that you guys are sharing. You know, I have no disrespect for, I would agree with a lot of the different aspects of this, but I think that's part of the reason why we felt it was, you know, I agree that it is an American problem and Americans have to take care of it, but there's also the reality that Hawaii has a very specific thing that Hawaii people can address, that Hawaii people can be outraged about. Just today, you know, military got dropped off on a Waimanalo Elementary. It almost, you know, it could have dropped on children who knew what type of supplies were. Luckily, it was MREs. But, you know, this is what military aggression looks like. Even if there isn't a nuclear war, even if there is a nuclear aggression, it's still going to be affected primarily on the Kanaka Maoli lands. And if we're talking about that in the long run, we're looking at military aggression, we're also looking at sustainability here. If we're talking about the massive containers that are going to potentially stop from coming here, we got to start talking about conserving water, returning the water to the agricultural bases, and not attacking our agricultural bases. So this is all connected into a larger picture as well. And so, you know, I understand that the focus is that, but we also have to have perspective that's from here as well. So mahalo nui loa, I call it out, but I'm afraid I couldn't just say keep that you know, off covered, but I need to make sure that at least the Kanaka Maoli and the Korean efforts, we've already been working together.
Right.
The peace treaty and the alliances. Hawaii is an occupied, peaceful, neutral nation. That this can be, instead of a jumping point of militarization, this can be a jumping off for peace for all of the Pacific. They can't meet in Pyongyang, maybe they could meet here.
Right.
And this is something that all of us, I think, as a people, that this is a compost thing, that we can all push for not just, you know, not just that, but looking at peaceful solutions, both here and also the Korean Peninsula. Mahalo loa, mahalo nui loa to Balkan for bringing up the reunification. So many people in Korea want to unify, and it is part of the disruptive policies of the United States, which is part of destabilizing that region. And so I really appreciate you guys. Thank you very much for letting me speak for this moment, and I'll allow, I don't want to take up much of our time. I know you got to sing now.
Mahalo. Kalama o kaina. Niheu.
A lot more conversations, we need a lot more panels, we need a lot more attention paid to war and the consequences of war and the escalation of war rhetoric, and our collective responsibility to make sure that there is no war, that there's no nuclear war, there's no escalation of it. And I think that there have been some common threads even amongst all of the disagreements, even amongst all of the different voices. One thing that shone out very clearly is the demand to take back nuclear war powers. That seems pretty clear to me. And also when Ralph said that there should be no first use policy for weapons of mass destruction of any sort, whether they're nuclear or biochemical, et cetera, and I think that that's a really great start. That's a great start for a movement to take back democratic control over these processes. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for the speakers.
Okay, thank you. This live broadcast will be play on demand as soon as the video that was actually stored on camera is uploaded, so maybe an hour. Okay, we're going to go play on demand in about an hour. Thanks for joining us from the Church of the Crossroads. Okay, here we go.